The morning mist hung thick over London Bridge, where thousands of severed heads stared down from their pikes, their hollow eye sockets warning all who passed beneath. On August 23, 1305, these rotting trophies would witness something far more horrific than their own deaths. They would watch as England's most notorious prisoner was dragged through the streets below, beginning a journey that would end in the most savage execution ever devised by medieval law. This wasn't just about killing a man, it was about destroying a legend. William Wallace had been Scotland's greatest warrior, a common-born knight who united clans and defeated English armies that outnumbered his forces 3-1. But now, stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle, he was about to discover exactly what King Edward III meant when he promised to make an example that would echo through eternity. This is not the Hollywood version. This is the documented reality of how medieval justice transformed a battlefield hero into chunks of meat displayed across 4 kingdoms. Medieval executions were not mere punishments. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to reprogram the minds of all who watched. Wallace's death would be the masterpiece of this dark art. By the end of this story, you'll understand why hardened soldiers vomited at the sight, why mothers covered their children's eyes too late, and why, even 700 years later, the details of what happened at Smithfield remain almost too brutal to comprehend. The rise of a legend. What makes this story compelling is that the man they were about to butcher wasn't supposed to be there at all. 8 years earlier, William Wallace had been a nobody, a minor landowner's son with no claim to fame, no great destiny, until the English came to his door. What they did that day transformed a peaceful man into the most feared guerrilla fighter in British history, and what Edward, known as Longshanks, did in response turned that fighter into an immortal symbol. The path to Wallace's capture was paved with Scottish blood and English gold. By 1305, after years of devastating warfare, most of Scotland's nobility had bent the knee to Edward. They calculated that submission meant survival, that their lands and titles were worth more than their country's freedom. But Wallace, the stubborn commoner who never swore fealty to any English king, remained at large. His very existence mocked their surrender. Edward's network of spies and informants stretched across Scotland like a spider's web. Every tavern keeper, merchant, and traveling priest could be in English pay. The king had placed a fortune on Wallace's head, 30 sterling, enough to buy a substantial estate, and made it clear that anyone harboring the outlaw would share his fate. The pressure was relentless, suffocating. Wallace's circle of trust grew smaller by the day. The betrayal. The betrayal, when it came, was almost predictable in its cruelty. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had recently pledged loyalty to Edward, orchestrated the trap. Some chronicles mention a servant named Jack Short, suggesting the conspiracy ran deep into Wallace's own household. The exact details remain murky, deliberately obscured by those involved. What we know is that on August 5, 1305, near Robroyston outside Glasgow, Wallace walked into an ambush he never saw coming. Imagine the moment. Wallace, perhaps exhausted from years of running, finally letting his guard down among those he thought were friends. Then, the sudden rush of armed men, the shock of recognition as he saw familiar faces among his captors. Historical records are sparse on his reaction, but they note he was taken alive, suggesting either the surprise was complete or he chose not to die fighting. Perhaps he still believed Scottish law would protect him. He was about to learn how wrong that belief was. The journey to London, the journey south, was its own form of torture. Wallace, the man who had made English soldiers flee in terror at Stirling Bridge, was now paraded through English towns like a captured animal, bound in chains, and, according to some accounts, displayed in an iron cage. He became a spectacle for crowds who had heard terrible tales of the Scottish demon. Children threw stones, women spat, and men who had never seen battle shouted threats at the caged warrior who couldn't respond. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or humiliation. It was knowing what awaited him in London. Wallace understood English law and what happened to those declared traitors. During those long days on the road, he had plenty of time to contemplate the specific horrors Edward had planned. Edward, a master of psychological warfare, ensured Wallace's imagination had all the fuel it needed. Arrival in London. London in August was a city of extremes. The Thames reeked of sewage and rotting fish, and the narrow streets trapped heat and stench like an oven. On August 22nd, when Wallace finally arrived, the entire city seemed to empty into those streets. The annals of London record that crowds of men and women poured out to see the famous rebel. This wasn't just curiosity. It was bloodlust, carefully cultivated by royal propaganda. They housed Wallace overnight at the residence of William de Lair in Fenchurch Street. Can you imagine that night? Knowing that tomorrow would bring not just death, but a destruction so complete that pieces of your body would be scattered across kingdoms. The guards reportedly heard him praying, though whether for deliverance or the strength to die well, we'll never know. When morning came, Wallace was ready to face whatever horrors awaited. The trial. The procession to Westminster Hall was a masterpiece of political theater. Wallace wasn't walked or carted like a common criminal. He was mounted on a horse, surrounded by the mayor of London, sheriffs, aldermen, and a retinue of knights. This wasn't transportation, it was a victory parade. Edward wanted every person in London to see that the great William Wallace was now utterly in his power. Westminster Hall, the largest royal hall in Europe, had massive oak beams soaring overhead like the ribs of some giant beast. On this August morning, it was packed with spectators who had paid handsomely for the best viewing spots. A wooden platform had been erected at the south end, high enough for everyone to see what was about to unfold. Then came the cruelest joke of all. As Wallace was led to the platform, they crowned him with a laurel wreath. The London Chronicles explained this was because Wallace had allegedly boasted he deserved to wear a crown in Westminster Hall. Whether he ever said such a thing is doubtful. What matters is that Edward's propagandists had turned Wallace's fight for Scottish independence into a pretension to kingship. The crown of laurels mocked not just Wallace, but the very idea of Scottish sovereignty. The judges sat in their scarlet robes, 5 commissioners specially appointed by King Edward for this occasion, led by Sir Peter Mallory, the King's Justice. These weren't impartial arbiters of law. They were Edward's men, chosen for their loyalty and willingness to deliver the predetermined verdict. The trial would be swift. When Sir Peter Mallory rose to speak, the hall fell silent. The charges were comprehensive, damning, and largely true. Wallace was accused of being a traitor to the King of England, of sedition, homicide, robbery, arson, and various other felonies. They detailed his attacks on English garrisons, his invasion of northern England, and his slaughter of English subjects, even accusing him of sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun, painting him as a monster who killed indiscriminately. Under English law, Wallace couldn't actually be guilty of treason, as treason required breaking an oath of allegiance, and Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. He fought for John Balliol, Scotland's rightful king, and later for the idea of Scottish independence. The English lawyers knew this, which is why they added the charge that Wallace sought to make himself King of Scotland, a lie necessary to justify what came next. When Mallory asked Wallace to respond, the Scottish knight spoke the only words he would be allowed at his trial. The exact phrasing varies between chronicles, but the meaning was clear and defiant. "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign. He never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it." Think of the courage that took, standing there, crowned in mockery, surrounded by enemies, knowing a horrific death was certain, yet refusing to acknowledge Edward's authority. Wallace didn't beg or negotiate. He stated the truth that had driven his rebellion. Scotland was not England's to rule, and he was not Edward's to judge. The court's response was swift and predictable. Since Wallace had been declared an outlaw, English law stated he had no right to speak in his own defense. His statement was legally meaningless. Mallory and his fellow judges moved immediately to sentencing, pronouncing a punishment that would have made even hardened soldiers blanch. For the crime of treason, Wallace would be drawn through the streets of London to the place of execution. For robbery and homicide, he would be hanged by the neck. For his crimes against the church, burning abbeys and killing clergy, he would be disemboweled, his entrails burned before his eyes. For his treasons encompassing all these crimes, he would be beheaded, and his body quartered, the pieces sent to different corners of the realm as a warning to other potential rebels. This wasn't just a death sentence, it was a blueprint for the complete annihilation of a human being, each element chosen for maximum suffering and humiliation. The execution. Within hours of the trial's conclusion, Wallace would discover that medieval executioners were artists of agony, and he was about to become their masterpiece. The moment the sentence was pronounced, the machinery of death sprang into action. Guards seized Wallace and stripped him naked, a final humiliation for a man who had commanded armies. They bound him to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to be dragged behind horses, constructed to maximize suffering by keeping the victim's body in contact with the ground while preventing protection of the head or vital organs. The executioners knew their craft well. They positioned Wallace face down on the hurdle, his arms stretched wide and secured with rough rope that bit into his wrists. His legs were spread and tied at the ankles, ensuring maximum contact with the ground. Some accounts suggest a wooden beam was placed under his chest to lift his head slightly, preventing him from being knocked unconscious too quickly by impacts with the cobblestones. The route from Westminster to Smithfield was carefully planned, not the shortest path but one that wound through London's busiest districts, covering nearly 4 miles. Edward wanted every person in his capital to see the great William Wallace reduced to a bloody, battered piece of meat. The procession moved at a walking pace, slow enough for crowds to gather and follow, fast enough to ensure continuous abrasion against the road surface. As the horses moved, Wallace's naked body scraped against the cobblestones. The first few yards abraded the skin, creating raw patches that stung with each movement. As the journey continued, the constant friction wore through the epidermis, then the dermis, exposing raw muscle tissue to the filthy London streets. Contemporary accounts describe the blood trail marking the procession's path, growing wider and darker as more of Wallace's body was ground away. The crowd pressed close, their behavior orchestrated by years of public executions. Some threw additional abuse, rotten vegetables, stones, excrement, dead animals, while others watched with fascination, witnessing the destruction of something once thought indestructible. The guards made no effort to stop the crowd's participation. This was all part of the show. Each thrown object another small humiliation, another reminder that Wallace was no longer human in the eyes of English law. The human body is remarkably resilient. Wallace didn't mercifully lose consciousness. Contemporary accounts suggest he remained aware throughout the journey, his eyes open, lips moving in what observers took to be prayer. The Lanercost Chronicle notes he seemed to be reciting psalms, though the words were inaudible over the crowd's noise. Every bump, every sharp stone, every impact registered in a nervous system already pushed beyond endurance. The dragging served multiple purposes. It exhausted the victim, depleting physical reserves needed to maintain dignity during the execution proper. It began the process of dehumanization, transforming a man into a bloody, dirt-caked thing, barely recognizable as human. And it provided participatory entertainment for the crowd, letting them feel involved in the destruction of England's enemy. By the time they reached Smithfield, Wallace's back and buttocks were flayed raw, with witnesses describing the white of bone through the worst abrasions. His face, despite the slight elevation provided by the chest beam, showed evidence of repeated impacts. Broken teeth, a shattered nose, one eye swollen shut. Yet he still lived, still suffered, still knew worse was coming. The horror at Smithfield. Smithfield was London's traditional execution ground, a patch of earth soaked with centuries of blood. On this day, it hosted a carnival atmosphere grotesque to modern sensibilities, but normal for medieval London. Vendors sold meat pies and ale to spectators who arrived before dawn to secure the best positions. Wooden galleries were erected for wealthy observers who paid premium prices to watch a legend die. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. The scaffold stood like a theater stage, raised high enough for everyone to see the performance. The executioner, likely John Malvoisin, London's official headsman, was a professional. This wasn't work for amateurs. The sentence required specific skills to keep the victim alive through multiple stages of agony. Malvoisin wore the traditional black hood, not for anonymity, everyone knew who he was, but as part of the ritual transforming a man into an instrument of state justice. His assistants, usually 3 or 4 men, had prepared their tools with surgical care. Knives sharpened to keenness, a brazier glowing with coals hot enough to sear flesh instantly, ropes, chains, and a quartering block positioned for efficiency. Wallace was hauled onto the scaffold, his raw flesh leaving blood smears on the wooden planks. The crowd's noise reached a crescendo, then died to an expectant hush. This was the moment they'd come to see. The great Scottish rebel, the terror of English armies about to be reduced to meat and memory. And the hanging apparatus was simple, a rough wooden gallows with a hemp rope noose. But this wasn't the merciful neck snap of later centuries. Medieval hanging was strangulation, slow and deliberate. The executioner positioned the noose with care, placing the knot behind Wallace's left ear to ensure gradual constriction. 2 assistants hauled on the rope, lifting Wallace until his feet cleared the scaffold by about 18 inches, high enough to strangle, not high enough to break his neck. The crowd watched Wallace's face transform as oxygen deprivation took hold. Involuntary struggles, bound hands clenching, legs performing a grotesque dance. His face turned red, then darker, then purple as capillaries burst. His tongue, swollen and protruding, turned black. Bloody foam formed at his lips as blood vessels in his throat ruptured. His one good eye bulged grotesquely, the swollen one wept blood-tinged fluid. The executioner watched with professional detachment, timing the strangulation perfectly. Too long, and Wallace would die prematurely. Too short, and he might recover too quickly. After approximately 3 minutes, long enough for Wallace to experience the full terror of suffocation, Malvoisin gave the signal. The assistants released the rope, and Wallace crashed to the scaffold floor, his abused body offering no resistance. For a moment, he lay still, and some thought he was dead. Then came the terrible gasping as his crushed windpipe tried to draw air, his body convulsing, bloody spittle flying with each desperate breath. The dismemberment. While Wallace struggled to breathe, the executioner's assistants moved with practiced efficiency. They dragged him to a special table, a heavy wooden frame with iron restraints. They positioned him spread eagle, securing his limbs with metal shackles that bit into already damaged flesh. The table was tilted slightly so the crowd could see everything. Wallace's head was secured with a leather strap across his forehead, preventing him from looking away from what was being done to his body. What came next was so brutal that even the bloodthirsty medieval crowd showed unease. The executioner approached with a specialized knife, long, narrow, and sharp enough to part flesh with minimal pressure. He made his first cut above the groin, a precise incision slicing through skin and fat. Blood welled, running down Wallace's thighs. The crowd leaned forward, some eager, others regretting their choice of entertainment. The emasculation was performed with clinical efficiency. Medieval executioners understood anatomy well enough to maximize pain while avoiding fatal hemorrhage. The removal of Wallace's manhood was done in stages. First the testicles, severed with precision, and held up for the crowd before being thrown into the brazier, the smell of burning flesh causing some spectators to retch. Then the penis, removed with deliberate slowness, as Wallace's screams echoed across Smithfield. The real horror began when the executioner moved to Wallace's abdomen. With the same knife, he made a careful incision from sternum to pelvis, cutting through skin and muscle, but avoiding major vessels. This required exceptional skill. Too deep, and the victim would bleed out quickly. Too shallow, and evisceration would be impossible. Malvoisin, experienced in this procedure, had a steady hand. As the executioner parted the layers of Wallace's abdomen, the crowd saw his organs pulsing within. Wallace, still conscious, could lift his head slightly and see his own viscera exposed to the afternoon sun. The executioner reached into the body cavity, grasping the small intestine, 20 feet of coiled tissue. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled, the sensation indescribable. Not just pain, but a deep, visceral wrongness as internal organs were dragged into daylight. The intestines emerged like a grotesque rope, thrown into the brazier, the burning adding another layer of horror as Wallace smelled his own organs cooking. Wallace's screams became barely human, a high-pitched keening beyond normal vocal cords. Some accounts claim he continued praying, calling on God and the Virgin Mary. Others say his vocalizations passed beyond language into pure agony. All agree he remained conscious, watching as his body was destroyed. The stomach, liver, and spleen were removed with surgical precision, each held up for the crowd before joining the intestines in the flames. The kidneys required the executioner to reach deep, his arms disappearing up to the elbows in blood and viscera. The final act. Wallace's body began to fail in ways even the skilled executioner couldn't prevent. His remaining eye rolled back, his screams faded to whispers, then nothing. His chest still rose and fell, but the movements were mechanical. Whatever made William Wallace himself, his courage, his defiance, retreated to some final redoubt of consciousness. Recognizing that Wallace was fading, the executioner moved to complete his work. The beheading required a heavy axe, tested for weight and balance. Wallace's mutilated body was dragged to the block. The crowd grew silent, understanding the spectacle was reaching its climax. The axe fell with a sound like a butcher's cleaver, but the first blow didn't sever the neck completely, whether from error or the awkward positioning of Wallace's ravaged body. His body convulsed in a final surge. The executioner raised the axe again, and the second blow separated head from body with precision. As tradition demanded, the executioner grasped Wallace's head by the hair and held it high, proclaiming, "The head of a traitor," the ritual words echoing across Smithfield. Blood dripped from the severed neck, and some witnesses swore they saw Wallace's lips moving, forming silent prayers or curses. Even death brought no end to the degradation. The quartering began, a systematic dismemberment with a massive cleaver. The arms were removed at the shoulders, then the legs at the hip joints. The torso was split down the middle, creating the 4 quarters. The assistants worked like a butcher shop crew, catching blood in buckets, organizing body parts, maintaining the ritual dignity of state-sanctioned murder. The aftermath. The crowd began to disperse, some silent and thoughtful, others chatting excitedly, comparing this execution to others. Children walked hand in hand with parents, who explained this was what happened to those who defied the king. The festival atmosphere reasserted itself as vendors made final sales. Wallace's head was parboiled in water and herbs to preserve it for display, then tarred and mounted on a pike on London Bridge, joining the gallery of traitor heads. The 4 quarters of his body were packed in salt and sealed in barrels for transport, one to Newcastle, another to Berwick, the third to Stirling, and the fourth to either Perth or Aberdeen. Each was a rotting reminder of English power and the futility of resistance, but Edward's plan unraveled. The brutality of Wallace's execution transformed him into a martyr. The quarters of his body, meant as warnings, became shrines. Scots visited these gruesome displays in reverence, drawing inspiration from the man who refused to bend. Robert the Bruce, previously an English collaborator, was deeply affected by Wallace's death. Less than a year later, he raised the standard of rebellion, reportedly saying he'd rather die like Wallace than live as Edward's slave. The English chronicles portrayed Wallace's execution as divine justice, emphasizing his crimes against churches and clergy. Yet, even in these hostile accounts, there's grudging respect for his courage and unease with the punishment's extremity. Scottish sources, though fewer, speak of his dignity, his refusal to recant, and his transformation into something more than human. Within days, Scottish minstrels composed raw, angry laments that turned English cruelty into Scottish determination. These songs spread faster than any army, carried by travelers and merchants. Singing about Wallace became a punishable offense in occupied Scotland, but this only drove the songs underground, where they grew darker and more powerful. Some of the most powerful voices spreading Wallace's legend were English soldiers who witnessed the execution. They expected to see a demon die, but saw a man endure unimaginable tortures without breaking. Their whispered accounts in barracks and taverns created a counter-narrative. Wallace the monster became Wallace the man, more frightening than any propaganda. The Scottish Church, despite its complicated relationship with Wallace during his life, embraced him in death. Priests drew parallels between his suffering and Christ's passion, transforming a political execution into a religious allegory. The quarters displayed in Scottish towns became pilgrimage sites, with mysterious offerings of flowers and ribbons appearing despite prohibitions. The English administration faced an impossible position. Removing Wallace's remains would signal weakness, but leaving them up created opportunities for defiance. Eventually, the rotting quarters were quietly removed, though rumors persisted that loyal Scots secretly retrieved and buried them, adding to the Wallace mythology. Legacy King Edward I died in 1307, still fighting Scottish rebels, his dream of conquering Scotland unfulfilled. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's will, and the Scottish resistance, energized by Wallace's death, triumphed at Bannockburn in 1314. Wallace's execution set a legal precedent, treating a foreign knight as a traitor to a crown he never served. This logic justified brutal suppression in Wales, Ireland, and later the American colonies. The execution became a template for dealing with resistance, its message clear: submit or face destruction. But the English never understood that martyrdom can be victory. Wallace's broken body united Scotland through shared outrage. Every Scot who heard the details of his execution became more determined to resist. Wallace gave his people a grievance that would never heal. The detailed documentation of Wallace's execution, unusual for its time, suggests the English knew they were making history. They created evidence of judicial murder that would indict English rule for centuries. Modern forensic analysis confirms the horrific efficiency of hanging, drawing, and quartering, with victims experiencing neurogenic shock, a dissociation where they remained aware but separated from their suffering. The crowd psychology at such executions created a unique dynamic where compassion was subsumed by mob mentality. Yet Wallace's suffering pushed even these boundaries, with some spectators leaving or looking away, unable to stomach the reality of judicial torture. The transformation of William Wallace from man to myth began the moment his head was mounted on London Bridge. By the 1470s, when Blind Harry wrote The Wallace, the historical figure had become almost supernatural. The execution scene became the climactic center of every retelling, with added details of defiance or mystical visions, transforming suffering into spiritual triumph. Wallace's declaration at trial, that he could not be a traitor to a king he never acknowledged, became a touchstone for resistance movements. The principle that legitimate authority requires consent was radical for its time, inspiring theorists of revolution for centuries. The visceral details preserved in chronicles demonstrate the medieval state's capacity for calculated cruelty. Wallace's destruction was a text written in flesh and blood, meant to deter rebellion. Understanding its horror reveals the courage required to resist such a system and the failure of terror to sustain control. Each era projected its concerns onto Wallace's broken body, a proto-Protestant martyr during the Reformation, a rational resistor in the Enlightenment, a symbol of Scottish spirit for romantic nationalists. Sites like London Bridge, Smithfield, and Westminster Hall became politically charged, anchoring the Wallace story in real geography. The brutal reality of Wallace's death resists sanitization, forcing even romantic retellings to confront the price of resistance. The English records, including the pipe roll detailing expenses, inadvertently testify to his significance. They succeeded in making history, but not as intended. The psychological impact on Robert the Bruce transformed him from collaborator to liberator. Wallace's execution became an example of judicial barbarism, cited by Enlightenment thinkers arguing against torture. The extremity meant to diminish him elevated him to mythic status. 7 centuries later, Wallace's death remains relevant. His executioners thought they were destroying a rebel. Instead, they created an immortal reminder that the human spirit, even when broken, can triumph over tyranny. His defiant words still resonate. Legitimate authority requires consent, and some principles are worth any suffering to defend.